In 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation. The purpose of this designation was to preserve for all Americans significant pieces of the country's history, ecology, geology, and beauty. All national monuments are designated by U.S. presidents and are chosen as their personal memorials of those most special parts of this great country. Memorials that they see a need to protect over all others. Some are big, some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff. Others, next to none. All were chosen by presidents who considered them the most important places to protect over all other places in the country. America's national monuments tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. Hello, I'm Jordan Murphy, and I will be your guide as we visit 12 national monuments located in America's southern states and territories. The worst war in American history was the Civil War, North against South. The three national monuments in this program help us understand why this war happened, how it began, and how a turning point in warfare helped lead the North to victory. The statue behind me is that of George Washington Carver. He was one of America's greatest scientists, but he was also born a slave. Near Joplin, Missouri, George Washington Carver National Monument tells the story of his life and the events that led up to the Civil War.
Tucked along the western edge of the Ozarks is a monument dedicated to one of the greatest men this nation has ever produced, George Washington Carver. Established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on April 5, 1943, the George Washington Carver National Monument is only one of three dedicated to an individual. The monument preserves the land where Carver was born, preserves the land that inspired Carver to greatness. The centerpiece of the park is a 1-mile trail that leads you through dense woodlands, across peaceful streams, and by the quiet ponds that meant so much to young Carver as he grew up. It also introduces you to his wise and environmentally enlightened philosophy through a series of plaques placed along the trail. The sun rises on the old Susan and Moses Carver farm. A rooster crows as it must have over 150 years ago. It was the height of the Civil War, 1864 to be precise. The trail begins with the forlorn outline of the 12-by-12 cabin where George Washington Carver was born to his slave mother Mary in that same year. His father was unknown. It was from this cabin that the infant Carver and his mother were kidnapped by Confederate raiders and sold to slave traders in Arkansas. Remarkably, by the efforts of the farm owner Moses Carver, baby George was returned to the farm. Sadly, his mother was killed in Arkansas. George was an orphan. Raised by the white Carver family until he was 12, George was nurtured by this land. On being an orphan, he said, "There was a great purpose in that I was just an orphan boy wandering around trying to find a place. In some way or another, I did not allow myself to get bitter. It is forgotten. A boardwalk leads to the famous Robert Amendola sculpture of Carver as a young boy. In his hand is a plant, root and all. Many are the tears I have shed because I would break the roots or flowers of some of my pets while removing them from the ground. And strange to say, all sorts of vegetation seemed to thrive under my touch until I was styled the plant doctor. The sculpture is set in the deciduous forest of oaks and walnut trees, stunning in their vibrant fall colors. The undergrowth is rich with lichens and mosses, a wonderland of nature for young George. More and more as we come closer and closer in touch with nature and its teaching, we are able to see the divine and are therefore fitted to interpret correctly the various languages spoken by all forms of nature about us. The trail crosses the Carver branch of the Shoal River. Then it's on to the spring-fed Williams Pond and the contemplative Loop Trail. I love to think of nature as an unlimited broadcasting system through which God speaks to us every hour, if we will only tune in. Adjacent to the pond is a restored tall grass prairie. A brilliant bouquet of prairie flowers blossoms during the spring and summer, and a bouquet of fall flowers bursts alive in September and October. At the apex of the trail is the historic Carver Homestead. Built in 1881, after a tornado wiped away the original buildings, it is where the Carver family lived after George left for school. It was to improving farms like this that Carver devoted his life. The primary idea in all of my work was to help the farmer and fill the poor man's empty dinner pail. My idea was to help the man farthest down. This is why I have made every process just as simple as I could to put it within his reach. The last stop along the trail is the Carver Family Cemetery. Although George is not buried here, his adopted parents, Susan and Moses, are. No individual has any right to come into this world and go out of it without leaving behind him distinct and legitimate reasons for having passed through it. The highlight of the monument's visitor center is 3 of Carver's original artworks. There is no shortcut to achievement. Life requires thorough preparation. Veneer isn't worth anything. However, it is along the trail deep in the woods, where as a young boy Carver observed and cared for the plants he discovered, that the presence of George Washington Carver can be felt. George Washington Carver National Monument is part of the Ozark Mountain System. The Ozark Plateau is around 50,000 square miles, covering sections of the states of Kansas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and a good portion of Missouri. The Ozarks are ancient. The bedrock outcrops that make up the Ozarks are dolomites and sandstones from the oldest era of life, the Paleozoic Age. These sediments are in distinct contrast to the younger flat-lying rocks that surround the Ozarks. How did the Ozarks come to be? 450 million years ago, a continental plate crashed into North America along the continent's east coast. This was part of the event that produced the supercontinent, Pangaea. The result of this tectonic activity was the formation and uplifting of the Appalachian mountain chain, which included what is now the Ozarks. When the uplifting ceased, a new process began: weathering and erosion. Then around 200 million years ago, as Pangaea was breaking apart, the separation of the continents created a great rift valley right in the middle of what would become the United States. A rift valley that is now filled by the Mississippi River Basin. The result was not only an earthquake-prone area that is still active today, but it also separated the Ozark Highlands from the rest of the Appalachian mountain chain. Today, the Ozarks are highly weathered and dissected by the many rivers and streams that flow from the thousands of springs that originate here. The weathering of the ancient Paleozoic rocks has exposed rich deposits of lead and zinc ore. However, the weathering of this rock has also produced nutrient-poor soil, which is not conducive to large-scale agriculture, making the Ozarks in the 21st century one of the poorer rural areas of the country. Prior to settlement in the early 1800s, the Ozarks supported one of the great eastern broadleaf forests. The primary species of this forest are the pointy-leafed red oaks and the smooth-leafed white oaks. The oaks are punctuated by a smattering of hickory and walnut trees. Today, only 3% of the original hardwood forest remains. But the forests are making a comeback as the Ozarks transition from agricultural to recreational land use. Recreational land use that is based on the many reservoir lakes that have become the signature feature of this ancient highland. The man who the George Washington Carver National Monument honors was a most extraordinary scientist, educator, inventor, painter, and visionary. In short, a Renaissance man. All of this is so remarkable because of what he had to overcome. He started life as an orphan black slave child growing up in the South. A childhood disease affected his vocal cords so that he sounded like this his whole life.
The day is here. Tomorrow is lighting up the distant horizon with new and unheard of gleams, fraught with almost unlimited possibilities for everyone who is prepared to do what the world wants done.
George Washington Carver has been an inspiration to Park Ranger Curtis Gregory.
He left here about the age of 12 years old, and from that point he was on his own for the rest of his life, struggling the entire way, getting schooling whenever he could, working most of the time, and he never gave up his dream of getting an education and becoming as he would say, helping his people as much as he could. And so I think that George is very important because of his I can attitude and never giving up his goals or his dreams. What George means to me personally is that he was an individual that, again, that he had certain goals at a time when society wasn't very kind to African Americans. And he never gave up, again, his I can attitude, where he could have, and he could have been very successful after he got an education, but he wanted to help his people. And he wanted to help his people as much as he could. And it brings back home a lot of Carver's ideals and things like that to me as well.
The most far-reaching of ideas, in retrospect, was the one that started right here in his first 12 years. That of the balance of nature, which during his life translated into the understanding of the need for environmentally sound, sustainable technologies. Incredibly, Carver knew in the early part of the 20th century what we in the first part of the 21st century need to do. Carver, being a black man, also participated in the events surrounding the Great Divide that has plagued the country since the first black slaves arrived in Jamestown in 1619. Racial conflict. Indeed, the state into which Carver was born, Missouri, was pivotal in the events leading up to the Civil War. Settled in the early part of the 19th century by slave-owning Southerners, Missouri would become a pivotal state in the fight over slavery. The first clash came when Missouri petitioned to join the Union in 1818. Northerners did not want another slave state, and Southerners did. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise temporarily settled the conflict by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. The compromise also banned slavery from the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern boundary of Missouri, except in the state of Missouri. This uneasy truce lasted 30 years. The next quarrel erupted in 1850 when Northern abolitionist senators wanted to use the admission of California as a free state to overturn the Missouri Compromise. War between the states was narrowly averted by the Compromise of 1850. It was a series of congressional acts which included the controversial Fugitive Slave Act. No one was happy. The final straw that forced the nation toward civil war was the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Dred Scott, a black slave now living in Missouri, went to court to get his freedom. The case went to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1857, the court ruled against Scott. At the same time, it ruled the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because all slaves were property, and Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories without violating a slave owner's constitutional right to own property. War loomed between the North and the South. And 4 years later, the bloodiest conflict on American soil began. Though during the war, Missouri was a border state, a state on the side of the Union. It spawned many Confederate guerrilla groups who fought to keep slavery, including those men who stole George Washington Carver and his mother and took them into the deep South. After the Civil War, Carver was part of that group of black men and women: Frederick Douglass, Robert Smalls, Ida B. Wells, and Booker T. Washington, who showed they were equal to any in this country. They were the first wave of black heroes. George Washington Carver joined Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute in 1896, where he researched and taught until his death in 1943. A life well lived by the boy who loved nature.
On that small island in the bay outside of Charleston, South Carolina, sits one of the most hallowed shrines of the Civil War. Fort Sumter National Monument preserves the site where it all began.
No city of the Deep South embodies the region's heart and soul more than South Carolina's Charleston. It is the region's oldest city, established in 1670. and during the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, the South's most historically significant. Fort Sumter National Monument captures those early historic moments by preserving two pivotal forts that guarded the entrance to Charleston Harbor. Today, these two forts echo with passionate cries from the long-ago battles for freedom and self-determination. This most historic of national monuments was set aside by President Harry Truman in 1948. One unit of the monument is Fort Moultrie on Sullivan Island. In 1776, the fort played a critical role in the nation's fight for freedom during the Revolutionary War.
Fort Moultrie is the site of the first major victory in the American Revolution. It was won by the Patriots there on June 28, 1776. It defeated a British naval force trying to come in and capture Charleston, South Carolina.
Today, it is a showcase of 170 years of the country's coastal fortifications. Artillery from the Civil War to World War II is on display here. From the fort's cannon deck, another fort is visible in the middle of the Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. Reachable only by boat, the whole history of the American Civil War unfolds here on these sacred grounds. It was built on a man-made island 4 acres in size.
The fort was a 5-sided pentagon-shaped structure with exterior walls 5 feet thick, 52 feet high, and the fort was designed to hold 135 guns within its walls and have living quarters inside for 650 officers and men. By 1860, it was about 90% complete, and at that point, South Carolina seceded from the Union and construction stopped.
Only part of the fort is still preserved today.
We're here on the parade ground of Fort Sumter. About a mile from where I'm standing to the east is Fort Moultrie, which played an important role in the bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12th and 13th, 1861. Here on the parade ground, you can see various levels of Fort Sumter's history. Of course, around us are the ruins of the fort, which show us somewhat what the fort looked like in 1861, but at the same time with these ruins, we can see what the fort looked like as a result of the bombardment starting in 1863. Behind me, you see some of the ruins of the officers' quarters. These were 3-story high townhouse or condominium-like living structures for those officers. And then also behind me, you can see a brick flooring, and that's the remains of a 3-story high enlisted men's barracks. Also over here, we have Battery Isaac UG, which was built for the Spanish-American War in 1898. That occupies the middle third of the fort. So right now we're only seeing about a third of the fort in its original size just on the parade ground. This is one of the types of cannons used in the bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12th and 13th, 1861. Both North and South had these types of guns. This is a 32-pounder smoothbore gun.
Other cannons on display within the fort are a battery of the famous rifled cannons that changed 19th century warfare forever. Sullivan Island, the site of Fort Moultrie, presents a wonderful opportunity to see one of the basic dynamic operating forces in ecology, plant succession. Plant succession is the slow process of one plant community replacing another as an area moves from pioneer plant species to a climax forest or climax grassland. Here at the monument, this process can be observed by walking along one of the trails that leads from the beach to the fort. Each day, the ocean's waves wash up tons of sand, forming a beachfront. Some of that sand is blown into ever-shifting dunes. Now plants take over. First, pioneer grasses begin the process of succession by stabilizing the dunes. Move a little further inland, and now the dunes have become stable, and the pioneering grasses have been replaced by low-lying shrubs and a variety of flowering plants. As we move even further inland, the land is now covered by a thick tangle of shrubs and emerging trees. The next step of coastal plant succession reveals that the understory is beginning to open up, and there is now a thick tree canopy overhead. The last step of succession in this area is the emergence of a coastal hardwood forest. A jungle dominated by live oaks and palm trees with a largely open understory. The whole process can take hundreds of years, but within the monument can be seen in the space of a 30-yard walk. The headline of the Charleston newspaper summed it up: "The Union is dissolved." On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Soon, other Southern states followed, and in February of 1861, they elected Jefferson Davis president of the Confederacy. Earlier, Major Anderson had moved his loyal Union troops from Fort Moultrie to the more defensible Fort Sumter. Throughout the winter and early spring, tension mounted between Sumter and the Confederate troops surrounding the island fort.
Charleston was the most important seaport on the South Atlantic coast of this new country, the Confederate States of America. They could not allow now a foreign power, the United States, to control the most important fort that could control all the shipping that would go in and out of this port of Charleston. Because out of here would go the rice, the cotton, the tobacco, and other products that the South would need for commerce to trade with European powers and countries to maintain their independence and nationhood. So they had to get the Federals out of here, and they would do it either by negotiation or by artillery fire if they had to.
So when Major Anderson refused to surrender, as they say, the rest was history.
At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a 10-inch mortar shell was fired from Fort Johnson, located about 1.25 miles from Fort Sumter. That shell exploded directly over top of the fort. That was a signal for all the Confederate guns that could bear on Fort Sumter to open fire. And so at that point, 43 Confederate guns and mortars would fire on the fort for the next 34 hours, firing well over 3,000 artillery projectiles at Fort Sumter. So finally the fort would surrender when it was on fire on the afternoon of April 13th, 1861.
From that point on, Charleston became a major gap in the Union's naval blockade of the Atlantic coast. And its forts would see many more battles.
Probably the most significant event that would happen here would begin on July 10th, 1863, when the siege of Charleston began by the United States Army and Navy. This would mark the longest siege of the war, running 587 days from July 10th, 1863 until February 17th, 1865. And Fort Sumter would be the focal point of that siege by the United States Army and Navy. Over the course of the siege, the United States Army and Navy would fire approximately 7 million pounds of artillery projectiles at Fort Sumter, making it the most heavily bombarded 2.5 acres on this continent in warfare. What would happen is when General Sherman's army captures Columbia, South Carolina on February 17, 1865, the Confederates down here in Charleston would evacuate all their positions in and around Charleston, and the next day, February 18, 1865, United States forces would move in, and the war would now be over with here at Fort Sumter and Charleston.
52 days later, on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee would surrender to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, ending the costliest war in American history. A war that started right here at Fort Sumter.
The fortifications here at Fort Pulaski National Monument near Savannah, Georgia, were supposed to be impregnable, but they weren't. This is the story of how on one day, April 11th, 1862, the nature of warfare was changed forever.
A giant container ship enters the mouth of the Savannah River, gliding past Cockspur Island en route to Savannah Harbor. Today, as it has been for over 200 years, this port is key to the economic success of the South. What the crew members of the ships see as they pass by the island is an old brick Civil War fort, Fort Pulaski. Named after the Revolutionary War hero, Polish-born Count Casimir Pulaski, who was killed by the British during the siege of Savannah in 1779, near this island. Designated a national monument in 1924 by President Calvin Coolidge, Fort Pulaski is an engineering marvel that a young Robert E. Lee helped design.
Corps of Engineers surveyed it, and in fact Robert E. Lee, on one of his very first assignments as a newly graduated, newly minted engineer from West Point, came here, situated the fort on the island, and actually drew the drawings for the constructions of earthen dikes to hold back the salt marsh. The uplands that you see on Cockspur Island were all engineered by the Corps of Engineers within the historic dike system. And then the land that we're standing on today, as well as any uplands that you see, are mainly as a result of man-made intervention. This was all marshland during that period, even up until today.
Now restored, the fortress is surrounded by a moat. In the quiet waters, turtles pop up their heads. A drawbridge leads into the fort. Inside, on the spacious parade grounds, Union soldiers prepare to fire the kind of rifled cannon that played such a pivotal role in the story of Fort Pulaski and in the eventual outcome of the Civil War. From the cannon deck, the scale and magnificence of the fort spreads out below. Surrounding the parade grounds are the living quarters, storage areas, and command center. Outside, in front of the drawbridge, are the earthworks that once covered the powder magazine. However, it comes with some surprise when circling to the back side of the fort to see the crumbling brick from one devastating cannon impact after another. Reminders of what happened here in 1862. The history of Fort Pulaski goes back to another American war, the War of 1812, fought against the British. During this war, the nation found that its harbors were defenseless from British invasion. So much so that Washington, D.C. was easily captured by a British fleet. When the war was over, politicians were driven to build a system of defensive coastal forts. Up until then, America's coastline had been virtually without forts.
The Army Corps of Engineers built the system of coastal fortifications to protect the United States from foreign invasion, and they selected this island, Cockspur Island, for the coastal protection of the Port of Savannah, which this island's actually had 3 fortifications: a colonial fort, an early American fort, and then this Civil War era fort, which historians refer to as a third system fortification.
The purpose of the forts, like Pulaski, was to keep harbors open for trade, and in this case, protected from attack by enemy ships. Once the Civil War broke out, it was critical to the South's chances of success to take control of the southern coastal forts, which were only lightly manned by loyal Union troops.
The governor of Georgia, he orders his troops in Savannah to come out and occupy Fort Pulaski.
Now it became critical to the North's success to take back the Confederate-controlled coastal forts.
President Lincoln had made a determination that they needed to take some of these coastal fortifications and ports to deny the South their economic power, the power of selling cotton.
Knowing this, General Lee decided to make Fort Pulaski the final line of defense for the Confederates' most important harbor, Savannah, Georgia. Lee personally took command of the fort he had helped build more than 30 years earlier.
And he says you need to do certain things inside the fort to protect the soldiers, to protect the powder magazine. But he said as far as Tybee Island, as far as the closest place where the Federals could stage an attack, it's 1.5 miles away. And in that period of time, conventional wisdom said that a cannon firing a smooth bore cannonball only had an effective range to breach fortifications of about 1 mile. And so Lee says this quote, he says, "They can make it hot for you with shells, but at that distance they cannot breach." So what we have here is really an interesting situation. One of the greatest military minds this country has ever produced, Robert E. Lee, says that this fort can't be beat. They're invulnerable. They're invincible. And it was really that quest for invulnerability that spawned this whole system of coastal fortifications. That story and that quest will come to an end at the seminal battle, the siege and reduction of Fort Pulaski, April 10th and 11th, 1862.
On those 2 days, not only would Fort Pulaski fall, but the nature of warfare would be changed forever. It came as a result of a new strategy by the Union commander.
He's going to be using some new technology that's called rifled cannons. This is a cannon that has a rifling on the inside, and instead of firing a spherical shell, it fires a bullet-shaped projectile. This gives the technology more accuracy, more range, and more penetrating power. In fact, there was a rifled cannon inside Fort Pulaski that the Confederates had. What is new about what Gillmore does is he concentrates the weapons. He puts all of the rifled cannons into 2 batteries. He also places them at the closest location on Goat Point of Tybee Island, about 1.5 miles away. He concentrates the firepower together in those 2 batteries, but he also concentrates where he directs that firepower. The Federals built the fort. They have the plans of Fort Pulaski. They know where the powder magazine is. They know if they attack the angle of the fort that faces Tybee Island and that they can breach that angle, they will have a clear field of fire across the fort to the powder magazine. This is their plan. Something like this has never been tried before. This fort is considered invincible. General Totten, who was the commander of the Federal forces and helped build a lot of these forts, he said, you might as well bombard the Rocky Mountains as bomb Fort Pulaski. And again, it's part of our country's quest for invulnerability. That's what Fort Pulaski was all about. 7.5 feet of brick. Robert E. Lee said it couldn't be breached at that distance. And yet Gillmore does that, does the impossible in less than 30 hours. Once you had rifled cannons against brick fortifications, coastal defense of the United States was changed forever. There was a new offense, but on April 11th, 1862, there was no new defense. So they had a powerful weapon, but no new defense against Europe, which was what these forts were designed for. It's a turning point in military history, and it signals the end of the role of all masonry fortifications around the world.
On those 2 eventful days, the 1,000-year era of castles and stone fortifications came to an end. This is the legacy of Fort Pulaski. Cockspur Island. The island Fort Pulaski was built on was engineered from a salt marsh. Salt marshes are one of the most uniquely adapted ecosystems on the planet. The plants that make up the salt marshes, grasses and rushes, thrive in brackish water that would kill most grasses, shrubs, and trees. Not only are salt marshes adapted to salt water, but they also endure the rising and falling of tides. Located along coasts, Estuaries and waterways between the barrier islands and the mainland, salt marshes are one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. They're often frequented by many birds, reptiles, and fish. An ecosystem related to the salt marshes in the southeastern United States are mangroves. Growing along the water's edge, mangrove trees are also adapted to saltwater and tides. Their tripod-like root systems have a deeply primeval feel. Today, a bridge takes the visitor across a beautiful salt marsh to and from Fort Pulaski. A salt marsh that witnessed the groundbreaking military events that changed the world forever.
Thanks for joining me on our tour of some of the Old South's most sacred Civil War grounds. I'm Jordan Murphy. In 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation. The purpose of this designation was to preserve for all Americans significant pieces of the country's history, ecology, geology, and beauty. All national monuments are designated by U.S. presidents and are chosen as their personal memorials of those most special parts of this great country. Memorials that they see a need to protect over all others. Some are big, some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff. Others, next to none. All were chosen by presidents who considered them the most important places to protect over all other places in the country. America's national monuments tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. Hello, I'm Jordan Murphy, and I'll be your guide as we visit 12 national monuments located in America's southern states and territories. In this program, I'll show you the ruins of prehistoric cities rivaling any in the ancient world. They were built by Native American cultures living here in the South. It's a largely unknown story, and it's a story you can learn by traveling to the region's 3 national monuments devoted to prehistory. Archaeologists are only now realizing the true engineering wonder that is Poverty Point National Monument. It's the oldest city on the North American continent.
Springtime comes to the lower Mississippi River Valley, the Mississippi Delta Flatlands. A chorus of birds heralds a new beginning. Ephemeral spring wildflowers are in full bloom below the emerging tree canopy. purple violets, miniature forests like May apples, stately trilliums, the curious jack-in-the-pulpits, and fields of phlox. At this time of the year, there are 100 shades of green, not the uniformity of summer's full foliage. A battered Luna moth slowly dies after mating. At this place in present-day Louisiana once stood the oldest city in North America. Established in 1988 by President Ronald Reagan, this site is now called Poverty Point National Monument. Although part of the National Monument system, it is administered by the state of Louisiana. Within the monument are the remains of the only city the world has ever seen built by a hunter-gatherer culture. At the center of the city was the Great Bird Mound. A staircase leads to the top. From this vantage point, one can see the many trees and shrubs that are in full bloom. On all sides, smaller earthen mounds are visible. To the west are 6 semicircular concentric terraces. On the terraces were the homes of this once magnificent city. Homes that might have looked like this. How many?
I think once you try to evenly do some spatial patterning out there, you're probably looking at 500 to 600 homes that would very easily fall in here, with a population maybe 1,000 to 2,000 at its highest point.
On the grounds of the monument is a visitor center containing some of the artworks of this mysterious culture, whose people were living at the time Stonehenge was reaching its completion. Here there are many objects of art and decoration that reveal a remarkable artistic sensibility. Who were these people who were able to do what no other hunter-gatherer culture has ever been able to do? Build a city that lasted for over 500 years. This is the mystery and wonder of Poverty Point National Monument. Sometime around 5,000 years ago, a group of Native American people, known today as the Poverty Point culture, lived along the lower Mississippi River and developed a unique ethnographic identity. They hunted upland game such as deer with stone-tipped spears hurled by an atlatl, a device that looked like this. They fished the adjacent rivers and lagoons. We know this from the beautiful plummets used to lure their nets. And they gathered roots from the plants growing in the nearby swamps. Then these hunter-gatherers embarked on something never done before. They figured out how to build a city built according to a master blueprint.
So they're choosing this spot. Again, it all comes back to food. For me, the story is how they sustain themselves. And in an abundance when you consider the massive earthworks, because these folks weren't just sitting around taking it easy. You know, they're moving probably 1 million cubic yards of earth out here, which is a Corps of Engineers size project. So there has to be enough within this environment to fuel that kind of an economy and corporate, work that they're doing.
The scale of what these people did was staggering. The city was formed by 6 concentric earthen embankments that now stand 6 feet high and are 140 to 200 feet apart. They are separated by ditches or swales, where the earth was removed to build ridges. From end to end, the outermost terrace is 4,000 feet in length. the inner nearly 2,000 feet. The terraces are divided into 6 sectors by 5 cross-cutting aisles or corridors. In the middle is a vast central plaza. Surrounding the terraces are 5 earthen mounds, including the giant bird mound. Centrally placed, the bird mound is over 75 feet high. From head to tail, it is 710 feet long, and from wingtip to wingtip, 640 feet. When archaeologists took aerial photos, what they saw were clearly the remains of a city built of earth. It just didn't seem possible. Throughout all of human history, advanced agriculture had always been necessary for cultures to move from nomadic to urban societies. Diana Greenlee has been studying Poverty Point.
When archaeologists first came here and started doing some excavations, and they discovered how large it is and just how amazing it is, they initially assumed that it had to be farmers, because in their experience they had not come across hunter-gatherers who could do or who did this sort of thing. And it wasn't until they actually started looking at the subsistence remains that it became clear that these were not farmers. It's just really amazing that a group of hunter-gatherers could construct all of this in a relatively short period of time. And it has really challenged anthropologists' assumptions about hunter-gatherer society and what they can accomplish.
Although no burial remains of the Poverty Point people have ever been found, many trade goods from thousands of miles away have been unearthed. This was clearly a trade center of great power existing in North America long before the birth of Christ. In addition to these trade goods, many small objects of art have been found. Beads, pendants in various geometric and animal shapes, hundreds of small decorative ball objects, effigies and drawings of cats and owls, a fine collection of spear points, and most remarkably, small female figures baked from clay. Poverty Point National Monument truly is one of the great wonders of the ancient world. However, that this city is found on the delta of North America's greatest river, the Mississippi River, is not a surprise, as many of the world's early civilizations were located on river deltas. Poverty Point National Monument is situated in a large geological system called a coastal plain. A coastal plain is defined as a low relief region of largely undisturbed sedimentary strata that dip gently in the seaward direction. Such areas generally have well-developed drainage systems. The Gulf Coast coastal plain, which extends from the Florida Panhandle to Texas, is influenced by the Appalachian and Ozark mountain ranges. At the time of the Poverty Point people, this coastal plain was dominated by prairie grasses, but were in time replaced by the hard and softwood forests seen here today. A unique feature of the coastal plain is the Mississippi River embayment. It represents a break in the former continuous Appalachian mountain chain. When the supercontinent of Pangaea pulled apart 95 million years ago, it created a tectonically active rift valley. That valley is where the Mississippi River flows today. It is the most important continental drainage system in the United States. Indeed, all rivers east of the Rockies and west of the Appalachians flow into the Mississippi River. Nearing the Gulf of Mexico, the river flow slows, dropping vast amounts of sediments in a plumed-shaped formation called the delta. The delta is characterized by shallow tributaries and swamps. It was along the banks of the Mississippi River near the delta that the Poverty Point people chose to build their fabulous ancient city. But don't expect to see the Mississippi River near the ancient city today, as the Mississippi's channel and delta are ever-changing.
Caves have always been sacred places for ancient cultures. The one here at Russell Cave National Monument in northern Alabama is no exception. Here, there's a record of over 8,000 years of continuous occupation.
The monument's sign marks the entrance to the most unique archaeological site on the North American continent. Russell Cave National Monument is tucked among the woods and rugged hillsides of the southern Appalachian Mountains in northern Alabama. It is part of the forested Cumberland Plateau. Here loblolly pines soar skyward. Here, rapidly dropping streams and rivers begin their journey south to the Atlantic Ocean. Here, the uplifted ancient rock strata are carved by those waters into canyons, waterfalls, and caves. Immediately upon entering the monument, one encounters Dry Creek, a seasonal stream that in the spring courses with rushing meltwater from the higher mountain peaks to the north. But now, in the fall, it is dry except for the occasional quiet pond. All along its banks, evidence of those torrents of rushing water are revealed by exposed tree roots gripping the shoreline. Dry Creek is a signpost, a roadway for over 9,000 years of Native American inhabitants of the region. A roadway home. The creek leads through the forest to massive rock bluffs. Home is near. Then a giant sinkhole. Below, chickadees flitter about. Only a few hundred more yards. Now the bubble of clear, fresh water. Spring water. And then the welcoming rock shelter. Home and witness to every prehistoric Native American culture that lived in the region. Designated a national monument by President John F. Kennedy in 1961. Today it is known as Russell Cave. Walking along the boardwalk that now leads to the cave is Park Ranger Larry Bean.
There's also the spring that's right in front of the cave, and this spring is a part that actually played a big part in making people come to Russell Cave. They had a shelter, they had a spring, and it was along a path where they could find it if they followed the creek.
Indeed, Russell Cave contains the longest record of continuous human habitation in the U.S. Inside today, there is a reconstruction of some early cave residents. There is a magical feeling standing inside this cave, looking out as thousands had done before. It's a feeling of being in a protective womb. The cave is constantly changing.
The cave itself has the condensation of the moisture on the rocks. On a cool day, the rocks cool off, and on a warm day with the high humidity, the rocks condense moisture like a cold drink, and that moisture will run to the low points and come to a drip mark, and that makes the drip marks in the floor. The droplets that hang there for a long time, and especially the ones that may seep through the limestone and pick up lime, they actually pick up enough calcium to hang there and evaporate and leave a little bit there, and those formations form over a long time period.
The drip marks are only the latest stage in the cave's long geological history. Russell Cave is carved out of cliff-forming rock of the Mississippian age. 350 million years ago, the area was covered by ocean. As sediments settled to the bottom, they eventually consolidated into rock. Then, as the continents collided, mountain building began.
And as this area was uplifted, the southern Appalachians actually in this area was uplifted fairly flatly, and then after the collision with Africa, there was a lot of overthrust belts to the east, and Sand Mountain and Lookout Mountain, both of them on the other side of the Tennessee River, are really flat-lying plateaus that are part of the Cumberland Plateau. The area in the higher part of the southern Appalachians was actually uplifted and crumpled and pushed up into more mountainous areas.
In time, the solid limestone developed cracks, and water found its way into those cracks. The water slowly dissolved and eroded away the rock, forming caverns. The erosion process here at Russell Cave was greatly accelerated when the last ice sheet retreated, sending huge amounts of meltwater rushing down Dry Creek into the labyrinth of caverns. Then sometime around 10,000 years ago, the roof of the cave collapsed right here, creating this giant sinkhole, which is visible in front of the present-day cave entrance. This event revealed the current entrance to Russell Cave. From then on, a continuous stream of sediments buried the remains of thousands of years of human occupation.
Russell Cave's depth, the sediment brought in by Dry Creek brought in enough sediment to make layer after layer story of Russell Cave. And the archaeological record from the Smithsonian excavation is 43 feet.
43 feet. The height of a 4-story building preserving over 9,000 years of human history. In 1953, a trail of Native American artifacts led to a cave hidden in a forested area adjacent to a farmer's field in northern Alabama. What archaeologists from the Smithsonian Institute found in the cave was a treasure trove of artifacts dating back some 8,000 years. They found spear points, tools, and bone fragments from each of the successive Native American cultures, beginning with the mammoth hunting Paleo-Indians. These nomadic hunters were replaced by the people of the Archaic period.
The Archaic period at Russell Cave contains almost every culture from around 8,000 or 9,000 years ago up till the Woodland period. And those people left in here some of the earliest bonefish hooks in the southeast, some of the earliest weaving textile impressions in the cave floor. It's actually a woven mat or basket that was impressed into the cave floor. several pieces of that was excavated. The earliest human remains in Alabama came from Russell Cave.
The archaic hunters were experts at using the atlatl, a device engineered to throw a spear accurately over great distances. Russell Cave Ranger Larry Bean demonstrates how the atlatl works.
This is a cane spear. The river cane was a native plant that was used in the southeast, at least in the later time periods. We don't know what all the spears were made out of, and many of them probably were made out of hardwood. But at Russell Cave they had reloadable spears, and they had a 4-shaft main shaft where they could clip them together. And the way the atlatl works is at Russell Cave they found deer antler hooks, deer antler handles, and stone weights. Now I have one of the simplest atlatls you can make. It's fork on a stick, and you just sharpen one end so that it fits into the bottom of the spear. You take that and use that as an extra leverage, so that hook actually launches your spear and gives you a longer arm and more leverage.
About 2,000 years ago, agriculture, particularly the growing of corn, made its way into the southeastern United States. From this practice, a new culture developed. It was called the woodland culture.
At Russell Cave, the woodland period begins with the advent of farming, bows and arrows, pottery, not necessarily in that order, but the people's culture changed and they started developing a group organization. They still use the cave extensively here, sort of like it was too good of a home to pass up. They had storage pits in the woodland period fairly extensively. The pottery here, we have over 13,000 pot sherds, which they range from the size of a dime on that, probably. Many of the cultures of the woodland period, almost all of them are represented here.
The last prehistoric period here was the Mississippian, the time of the great walled cities and ceremonial mounds. But by this time, Russell Cave was only visited by the occasional traveler. Still, nowhere else tells us more about the early Native American people who occupied the historic South for over 12,000 years, better than Russell Cave.
The doorway behind me leads to a ceremonial room that was once part of a great Mississippian city located in Georgia's Ocmulgee National Monument. The city was part of a network of spectacular pre-Columbian cities that spanned the entire eastern half of the United States.
Rivers that begin as raging torrents pouring out of the Appalachian mountain chain suddenly slow. These rivers, such as the Ocmulgee, have just crossed the dominant geographical feature in the Old South, the fall line. Now turtles sun themselves on sandbars as the rivers continue their leisurely journey to the Atlantic. After an evening storm, Walnut Creek, swollen with the red clay that Georgia is known for, empties into the Ocmulgee. Nowhere in the south is the fall line, the division between the rolling hills of the Piedmont to the north and the coastal plain to the south, better represented than at Ocmulgee National Monument. Here is one place where the last vestiges of the hardwood forests to the north and the beginning of the famous southern swamps can be found in one place. It is where the semi-tropics begin. Here, every little nook is a new microenvironment. The edge of a pond, the bark of a tree, a fallen log. Here at Okmulgee National Monument, a newly constructed boardwalk carries the visitor across one edge of the emerging swamp. Okmulgee was designated a monument in 1936 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okmulgee is more than just a wonderful ecotone. An imposing mound towers over the swamp's bottomlands. It's called the Great Temple Mound. Okmulgee National Monument also preserves what was once an ancient city.
We are in the middle of a large village. Back then, I think it would have easily been judged to be a city, 2,000 to 3,000 people living in this immediate vicinity. And from this, we can learn a lot about how they were organized socially. How were their buildings arranged in groupings? What was the relationship of the houses compared to spiritual places and political and social gathering places?
One of those special places is a reconstructed earthen lodge, the ceremonial building where the ancient city's people and spiritual leaders met to conduct business and perform religious ceremonies. Inside, a large bird effigy was carved into the lodge's 1,000-year-old floor. The people that lived here were part of the Mississippian culture that formed a vast interconnected network of cities, spanning the entire eastern half of the United States. Inside the visitor center at Okmulgee National Monument survives one of the finest collections of Mississippian pottery. A particularly prized piece is called Little Boy. It is not surprising that these Mississippians built their city here on the banks of the Okmulgee River. All Mississippian cities were built on rivers. In particular, the people living here must have been able to exploit the rich biodiversity of the ecotone. We now know that the Mississippians were as advanced as any civilization in the Americas at that time. Around 700 AD, a remarkable transformation took place in the eastern half of the United States. Stephen Rudolph has been studying this change in the Native American economy.
The Mississippians showed up around the year 900, and they arrived with a different cultural idea. Agriculture as a main function of the society. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. Those three agricultural products change a culture dramatically. They allow your children to grow up more healthy. They allow the older folks to live more successfully and pass on the knowledge they've gained. And it becomes a dependence on that agriculture, which is generally an advantage to the society. We also found a trade network that comes with these Mississippian people that extends throughout much of this part of the country. And so we look at that as an idea rather than a simple idea, a very complex idea. The people who are here were part of a much larger society that stretched up and down the entire Mississippi all the way to the coast.
This remarkable network of cities could almost be viewed as a trade empire. Its capital, called Cahokia, was a city of over 20,000 inhabitants near present-day St. Louis. A typical Mississippian city looked something like this. Laid out as a rectangle, the cities were usually walled. Outside of the palisades were the agricultural areas. Unlike European cities, at the center was a large open space, common grounds where games could be played. On one side of the open space were the living quarters of the average citizen. The other side was reserved for the elite ruling and religious classes. Finally, every city had a number of large pyramidal, ceremonial, and burial mounds. Structures that, if they had been made of stone, would have been among the great wonders of the ancient world. We now know something of how these people looked. They drew themselves on seashells. At Okmulgee National Monument, archaeologists have reproduced a number of these drawings on a backlit glass screen. At about the time the Europeans arrived in the New World, all the great civilizations of North America were in decline. Still, when Hernando de Soto on his journey of discovery in 1539 encountered Mississippian cities, he described them as urban complexes of incomparable splendor. His descriptions were thought to be pure fancy. We're just beginning to understand the remarkable accomplishments of the Mississippian people. Two of the geological provinces of America's Old South are represented at Okmulgee National Monument.
What we're here on is the edge of the Piedmont. This is actually the toes of the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Piedmont is foot mountains in French, and it's actually the toes. Here's where it ends and the coastal floodplains begin. And in ancient times, this was the edge of the ocean.
All of the South's topography and climates are influenced by the Appalachian mountain chain. 300 million years ago, the birth of the Appalachians took place as a result of the continental collisions that resulted in the formation of the supercontinent, Pangaea. Today, the Appalachians are a highly eroded old mountain system. At its core are the Blue Ridge Mountains. Here, thrusting into a smoky blue sky, are the Appalachians' highest peaks. Peaks composed of sea sediments from the Paleozoic era. Driving south and dropping lower, one encounters the Piedmont geological region, characterized by rolling hills composed of metamorphic sea sediments and igneous rocks rich in feldspars. Feldspars, when weathered, produced the famous red soils that are particularly prevalent in central Georgia near Okmulgee National Monument. Then the Piedmont drops off into three large coastal plains: the northern coastal plain, the southern coastal plain, and the Gulf coastal plain. Walking across this remarkable fall line, the boundary between the Piedmont and the southern coastal plain, one experiences what makes Okmulgee National Monument such a special place. A pivotal point of geology, ecology, and ancient history.
Thanks for joining me on our trip through the Southern Prehistoric National Monuments. I'm Jordan Murphy. In 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation. The purpose of this designation was to preserve for all Americans significant pieces of the country's history, ecology, geology, and beauty. All national monuments are designated by U.S. presidents and are chosen as their personal memorials of those most special parts of this great country. Memorials that they see a need to protect over all others. Some are big, some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff. Others, next to none. All were chosen by presidents who considered them the most important places to protect over all other places in the country. America's national monuments tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. Hello, I'm Jordan Murphy, and I'll be your guide as we visit 12 national monuments located in America's southern states and territories. From the earliest days, the culture in the South was dominated by the plantation system and slavery. In this program, we'll see 3 monuments that preserve the story of that tragic chapter in American history. Behind me is a dungeon where black men from Africa were held before being shipped to the colonies. It's not commonly known that America owns 3 Caribbean islands that were once part of the slave trade. But here in the Virgin Islands, 2 national monuments, Buck Island Reef National Monument and Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument, tell not only the story of those early days of slavery, but also preserve some of the most spectacular underwater coral reefs in the world.
St. John, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and Buck Island host 5 units of the National Park System, including 2 national monuments. Buck Island Coral Reef National Monument, dedicated by President John F. Kennedy in 1961, and Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument, brought into the park system by President William Jefferson Clinton. Situated off the northeast shore of St. John Island, Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument is largely underwater. Here is a spectacular coral reef, vibrant displays of color, sea fans, brain coral, sea wisps. There are over 400 species of fish living among the coral reef, all available to the adventuresome snorkeler. But the monument's main function is to create a no-takings preserve for at least 1 coral reef, to create a nursery of new coral for dead and dying reefs around the world, and to create a sanctuary for the first ever endangered species of coral, the elkhorn coral.
The elkhorn coral, I keep coming back to it because I think it's fascinating that it is on the endangered species list now as threatened, and it has a unique morphology. There's no other species out there that can be that large and branching, and it literally does provide shelter for other endangered species such as hawksbill sea turtles. I've seen small sharks in the elkhorn, octopus, parrotfish sleeping in it at night, and when that is gone, you've really lost a lot of the reef structure.
And as Dr. Rogers mentioned, it is a no-fishing area for larger fish such as barracuda. and sharks. And it's a place where endangered sea turtles can swim free. East of St. John's Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument is the largest of the Virgin Islands, St. Croix. It is an island where ecosystems range from parched desert to verdant highland rainforest. A rainforest with succulent vegetation, massive trees, and indigenous reptiles. But history too abounds here. At this coastal spot, Christopher Columbus landed in 1493 on his second voyage to the New World. Ponce de Leon was its governor in 1509. However, the abandoned sugar mills tell the island's greatest story. The story of slavery. The souls of black men and women brought from Africa haunt these ruins. They haunt the fort, where slaves arrived after a 5,000-mile journey of starvation, torture, pain, and bondage. And they haunt the cells, where black men and women were held and beaten. Today, Old Fort Christiansvern is the headquarters for Buck Island Coral Reef National Monument. It is also the principal point of departure for boats heading to Buck Island. Buck Island is the smallest of the U.S. Virgin Islands and is totally managed by the Park Service. It has trails leading to a unique assortment of plants and insects. Plants and insects often punctuated by a dash of red, such as the ramhead cactus and the frangipani caterpillar. However, the monument is best known for its underwater trail.
You can hop on a boat in Christiansted, and within 35 to 45 minutes, you are on a barrier reef. Our concession operations bring folks out for daytime trips, and they bring them out here to the underwater trail. They give those folks that have never been snorkeling enough of a snorkel lesson to safely get in the water with a mask, snorkel, and fins on and experience the reef firsthand. And then they go off behind a guide and they will snorkel through the barrier reef. They will actually be traveling through coral grottos. It's not like, you know, you can only walk on the trail at Yosemite and you can't walk into the big giant redwoods. At Buck Island, you are amongst our redwoods. You are in the coral barrier reef itself, which at this point in time is between 8,000 and 10,000 years old. This living marine invertebrate that built the reef has been building and maintaining this reef for almost 10,000 years. So as you snorkel through, just think you're not in a concrete jungle, although it looks like stone. The coral skeleton is made of calcium carbonate, very similar to our own skeleton material. And that's their home, sort of like massive condominiums underwater. All colors and sizes and shapes. You've got the branching corals, you've got the massive head corals. And as you travel through, remember you're in their world.
There's nothing in the world quite like this. Lazy, warm temperatures year-round. Lush vegetation. Pristine white sand beaches. And the quiet swell of the sea. Yet the origin of the Caribbean islands is one of violent volcanic eruptions and the smashing of continental plates into each other. The result has been a volcanic mountain chain, the tops of which rise above the Caribbean Sea to form islands. The Caribbean islands are divided into three main groups. The most westerly are the Bahamas. In the middle lie the Greater Antilles, including Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. The eastern islands form an arc from Puerto Rico to South America. These are known as the Lesser Antilles. The Virgin Islands make up the westernmost unit of this group. While most of the Caribbean islands are volcanic in nature, St. Croix and Buck Island are different.
The island itself is, it's not volcanic. That's a really important point. Makes it very different from our northern island sisters in the Virgin Islands and the British Virgin Islands. So again, we're a sedimentary island that was formed through continental uplift. Where you've got the Atlantic plate north of us is pushing underneath Caribbean plate. St. Croix and Buck Island sit on this one. And we're through continental uplift. The islands have lifted up, and you'll see when we go ashore today that a lot of the layers of volcanic ash, very, very ancient volcanic ash that was laid down in the bottom of the ocean, created the base of the island, and those layers are now sitting up on edge. So you see these beautiful layers of brown dirt, which is now rock, because it's eons old, and in between it are white layers of quartzite, and then black layers, different layers of minerals that have settled out of seawater. So all of this is up on edge. It's sort of a geologist's paradise. You can actually, instead of having to drill into the ground, you can just look at these layers of the island right on edge.
Located near the equator, the U.S. Virgin Islands have a tropical climate. Hot days, warm and humid nights. However, the greatest factor in determining which ecosystems occur where are the constant easterly winds that sweep across the islands. As a result of these winds, the eastern side of each island is dry, barren desert and scrub, while the western side is lush tropical rainforest that is now making a comeback after being cleared during colonization. Even though the rapidly growing rainforests are impressive, there is very little native wildlife to be found. In fact, there is still much evidence of the sugarcane and cotton plants that once replaced indigenous vegetation. Efforts are now underway on Buck Island to restore all the original vegetation and reintroduce the indigenous wildlife such as these lizards. Part of this effort on Buck Island is protecting the nesting habitat of the hawksbill sea turtles, a turtle that has been hunted to near extinction for its stunning tortoise shell.
We had a hawksbill nesting last night. As you can see, the curve of her flipper. So as she pulled herself up in an alternating gait, she came up here. Okay, you can see hawksbills don't have any problem coming into a complex vegetative area, and they'll start to do their first attempt at finding a nesting location just after the slope finishes, just where it starts to level off.
By morning, the eggs are laid and covered, and this rather smallish sea turtle is back swimming over the barrier reef. Indeed, these national monuments are really about a marine ecosystem. Coral barrier reefs. Some would say the most biodiverse ecosystem in the world. Corals are very small, very primitive animals, which build very large calcium carbonate structures in which they live. Corals can be found living in clear oceanic waters on either side of the equator. But what exactly is a coral reef?
A coral reef is a living structure, And there are over 40 species of corals that live in the Caribbean and deposit limestone structures. And when you're looking at a coral colony, you're looking at the living tissue on the outside of the limestone that the coral deposits. And the largest living structure in the world is really the Great Barrier Reef, which stretches for over 1,200 nautical miles along the east of Australia. So it's a living structure which actually is based on coral colonies, which can be considered sort of solar-powered animals, because corals contain the symbiotic algae or the zooxanthellae in their tissues, and that's what largely gives them a lot of the color that they have. The zooxanthellae can be thought of as little plants, microscopic plants that are actually photosynthesizing. So corals function like plants in the sense that they, like plants and animals. They're basically animals, but they can function like plants because of their symbiotic algae.
When snorkeling over the barrier reef, it's easy to see the massive remains of the old coral structures. Schematically, a coral reef looks like this. In the era of global warming, that is, rising average global temperatures, corals are the canary in the coal mine. What happens to them warns us of impending danger. Coral live near the upper level of their temperature range. A few degrees warming of the ocean causes them to expel their symbiotic algae. The result is called coral bleaching. Bleaching is followed by disease and death. With massive coral bleaching occurring around the globe, marine biologists are concerned that if sea temperatures continue to rise, the spectacular coral reefs may soon disappear. And with them, that great oceanic biodiversity. Ever more reason to support the conservation efforts of these two national monuments. America's history has from the beginning been deeply intertwined with the Caribbean islands. It was the English kings favoring the interests of their more lucrative island colonies of Barbados and Jamaica over the fledgling American colonies that led in part to the Revolutionary War. And it was from the islands that the United States slave-based Southern Plantation Society arose. But it wasn't until 1917 that the United States flag finally flew over a group of Caribbean islands, when America bought for a mere $25 million the Danish West Indies and renamed them the U.S. Virgin Islands. When Columbus arrived at St. Croix in 1493, he found a thriving native population of people known as the Caribs. Within 100 years, these people and their culture were completely gone. And in another 50 years, a new one began. One based on slave trade and sugar plantations. The ruins of the over 400 plantations are now scattered across the islands. Like the Mayan ruins in Central America's jungle, the island's plantations are returning to nature. Charles Green's ancestors lived on this one.
And where we're standing right now, they used to call here Davis Beach. And all these old ruins that you see down there, it was sugarcane plantation, the whole area. And the old ruin is where the slaves used to live that work on the plantation.
The typical sugar plantation was 250 to 300 acres in size, with approximately 2/3 of the land planted to sugarcane. Once mature, the cane needed to be crushed to release its sweet juice. This was done by giant rotating wheels of stone. The wheels were powered by beasts of burden, or, in most cases on the islands, by windmills. In this society, the landowners became fantastically rich. The slaves did all the work, and for it, they suffered.
Sugarcane is like this, that you get them grow, you have to cut up sugarcane and stick them in the ground. And then they grow to different height. When they be a year old, when they're ripe, ready to reap, they reap it down here, take it up the hill, and squeeze the juice out of it, and then boil the juice into syrup, barrel it, and ship it off the island.
It was terrible work, and the slaves were brutally managed.
Life on the plantation was pretty rough. Penalties were very severe. There's a process called the seasoning process, which is a process that was used on a plantation to help the slave adjust from freedom to enslavement. And that process, a lot of slaves who did not conform were killed during that process.
The final product that came from the plantation was molasses, which could be used as a food sweetener, but was more profitable when converted to rum. Perhaps even more insidious than the plantations was the slave trade. The bringing of black men and women from West Africa for auction and retransportation to North and South America. The focal point of the slave market in the Danish West Indies was Fort Christiansvern in the island's capital city of Christiansted.
The golden era, or the plantation era, was in the mid-1800s. Slavery was very popular during this time period. As a matter of fact, on this, within these park boundaries, you have the largest former Danish slave trading compound under the United States flag, where over 50,000 slaves were sold, brought from West Africa, known as the Golden Triangle, was sold here in Christiansted at auction, right across the street from the fort.
What was it like to be human cargo on one of those slave ships?
We have documentation of what a voyage from West Africa to Christiansted would have been like. A medical doctor documented on one of the voyages the loss of life, not just of the slaves, but also of the deckhands that worked the ship. Mortality was very, very high. This journal also talks about how, as the journey progressed and they got closer to the island of St. Croix, how they would start to feed the slaves more appropriately. They would start to take better care of them, so that by the time they landed here in Christiansted Harbor, they would be a lot more presentable. We also have documentation and actual auction that took place here in Christiansted, and as one writer described it, it was like a feed-in frenzy for the estate owners coming from, the plantation owners coming to Christiansted to participate in this auction.
This culture of slave-based plantations was brought to the American colonies by the middle of the 17th century. Around the time the United States Civil War ended slavery in America, the era of slavery and sugar plantations ended on the Virgin Islands as well. Today, their economy is based on tourism and oil refining. The islands have an appealing, dominant black culture with a unique Caribbean flair, side by side with marine sanctuaries preserved by the Virgin Islands' 2 national monuments.
Many still say George Washington was our greatest president. He was born here, on a Virginia plantation near Jamestown, where the great American experiment got started. This part of our country's history, slavery, the plantation system, coupled with the early years of our nation's first president, are preserved at George Washington's Birthplace National Monument along the shores of Virginia's Chesapeake Bay.
A place of rose in time and scented earth, a place the world forgot. But here a matchless flower came to birth. Time paused and blessed the spot. That flower was George Washington, a founding father of the greatest experiment in democratic self-governance, the United States of America. The George Washington Birthplace National Monument memorializes the site where George Washington took his first breath. A signature Washington obelisk, 1/10 the size of the one in the nation's capital, marks the park's entrance. Established on January 23, 1930 by President Herbert Hoover, it preserves not only the birthplace of George Washington, but also the Chesapeake Bay tidewater land that was the starting point of the first English colony in 1607. Virginia's Jamestown Colony. It was out of this wilderness of dense hardwood forests, divided by gentle streams and rivers draining into the bay, that the earliest Virginia plantations were carved. One such plantation was the Pope's Creek Plantation, acquired by Augustine Washington, George's father, in 1717. Already a third-generation American, Augustine built the house where George would be born around 1724. Later destroyed by fire, a memorial house was built on the birth site and furnished as the original must have been in 1732, when Washington's birth was recorded in the Washington Family Bible. On February 11th, 1732, when jasmine and jonquils were beginning to bloom and dark purple berries were forming on the native cedar trees, Mary Ball Washington gave birth to her first child, a boy she named George. The time was about 10 o'clock in the morning.
It's one of the most important Washington sites to understand George Washington, the person. We can understand George Washington, the general, we can understand George Washington later in life, George Washington, the president, but really to get that sense of what it was like to be a child and to grow up into this colonial plantation system, this is the place to go.
The monument has rebuilt the plantation, complete with living history to provide an experience of what life would have been like for young George Washington. Indeed, Pope's Creek is much as it was when he played and explored along its banks, developing his keen interest in science and balanced approach to life. An approach to life that served him well as a soldier, commander of the Revolutionary Army, statesman, and first president of the United States of America. Although George only lived here for 3.5 years before his father's death, the Pope's Creek plantation stayed in the Washington family. As a result, much of his formative years were spent here, staying with his uncle. Living alternately at the plantation and at his mother's farm, Mount Vernon. The place George would inherit and live out his final years. The highlight of the monument is the Washington Family Cemetery. Here are the remains of George's great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and 29 other members of their early Washington family. A fitting remembrance to those who produced a man who was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. The George Washington Birthplace National Monument sits in the Tidewater area of the Chesapeake Bay. The Tidewater is a landform east of the Appalachian Fall Line, a line that separates the rolling hills east of the Appalachian Mountains from the area that was once ancient coastal shores. As a result, the Tidewater is virtually flat, only a few feet above sea level. The most prominent feature near the monument is Chesapeake Bay, a large body of shallow waters that drains numerous rivers, including two of the most famous in American history. The James River, where Jamestown Colony was founded, and the Potomac, where the United States Capitol was built. Pope's Creek, along which young George Washington enjoyed his early days, drains into the Potomac River. The Greater Chesapeake Bay is an estuary, a place where freshwater and oceanic saltwater mix. And as the name Tidewater implies, the bay is subject to the rise and fall of the tides each day. The ecosystem that colonists found when they arrived in 1607 was a densely forested area dominated by loblolly pine and oaks, still important habitats.
Today, though, I will say that Pope's Creek is still a valuable estuary. In the winter months, we have a plethora of waterfowl that come to utilize this area. We also have a lot of Anadromous fish, which are the ones that their adult life is out in the Atlantic, and then they come in to the Potomac and other estuaries like this.
Interestingly, with the once vigorous tobacco plantations and their destructive agricultural practices long gone, Pope's Creek has reverted to prehistoric times. What was that like?
It was pretty much like it is now. Open in some areas, grasslands, and then forested, heavily forested. And that was pretty much what you see right now. And George Washington probably could come back today and look at this area and say, hey, it looks pretty familiar.
When George Washington was born on the Pope's Creek plantation, he was born into a flourishing tobacco plantation system. A system imported from the Caribbean islands, already existing sugar plantations. This system, applied to the planting and harvesting of tobacco, undoubtedly saved the fledgling Virginia colony and secured the establishment of what would become the United States of America. But it also brought the enslavement of blacks from Africa to the North American colonies. This would prove to be the single most divisive factor in the history of the nation. How did the system get started in Virginia?
We've been farming in Virginia since 1612 with the introduction of tobacco in Virginia, and that was something that caught on really quickly with the Jamestown settlers because they were aristocrats, typically second, third, later sons, who weren't really used to working. So when they came to Jamestown, their expectations were to have actually literally gold in the street. And when that didn't pan out, then there was John Rolfe had smuggled South American tobacco into Virginia. We had a native tobacco that was harsh, wasn't marketable. The Spanish had already started the system of tobacco planting in South America, and so when it was brought to Virginia, it really took off. It was a high-priced commodity at the time, made a lot of money, but of course, as the market started to flood, there was a demand to make more money, and because of that, they had to import labor, first from Europe in terms of indentured servants, and then slaves from Africa.
Slavery offered the plantation owner a permanent solution to his labor problems. The slave could be resold if necessary. Indeed, Virginia colony became the largest exporter of slaves. And slaves raised families, so when the parents died, they left new generations of slaves to take their places. By the beginning of the 18th century, every colony sanctioned slavery by law. And by the middle of the 18th century, in every colony with large plantations, half or more of their population were enslaved by the other white half. 50 years later, as the viability of tobacco as an agricultural commodity waned, the plantation system and slavery might have died a natural death except for a new crop: cotton. It would take a civil war and the mechanization of farming to end the plantation system in the South. And as for Washington, who grew up with slavery and was a slave owner all his adult life, in the end he knew slavery would hurt the nation he worked so hard to create.
George Washington himself, who I think must have understood the irony of fighting for liberty for so long and dedicating his life to a new republic founded in freedom, yet owning people himself. Washington was never someone for drastic moves. Everything you see is very deliberated, thought out, and the same was true of slavery. What he did was he couldn't free all the slaves of Mount Vernon when he died, because some of them were meant to be inherited by Martha Washington's descendants. But he did all the slaves that he had control over, said that they would be freed upon the death of Martha. Martha actually sped up that process and freed them before that time, before her death.
George Washington, the father of our nation, died in 1799, 67 years after he was born right here at Pope's Creek Plantation.
Thanks for joining me on our voyage to those monuments that preserve those early days of the plantation system. I'm Jordan Murphy. In 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation. The purpose of this designation was to preserve for all Americans significant pieces of the country's history, ecology, geology, and beauty. All national monuments are designated by U.S. presidents and are chosen as their personal memorials of those most special parts of this great country. Memorials that they see a need to protect over all others. Some are big, some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff. Others, next to none. All were chosen by presidents who considered them the most important places to protect over all other places in the country. America's national monuments tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. Hello, I'm Jordan Murphy, and I will be your guide as we visit 12 national monuments located in America's southern states and territories. In this program, we're going to travel to 3 monuments that tell the story of colonial Spain in the South, of the 3 European countries vying for control of what would become the United States. Spain was the first to establish a colony, more than 40 years before the English founded Jamestown. Spain's first colony in the United States was located in St. Augustine, Florida. Now, not only is it the oldest continuously occupied city in the nation, but the two forts that protected it from attack by pirates and the British still stand today along Florida's northeast coast. They're preserved in Fort Matanzas and Castillo de San Marcos National Monuments.
Before there was the English settlement at Jamestown, there was St. Augustine, the first permanent European colony on the land that would become the United States of America. Founded in 1565, it was the first Spanish colony. Eventually, it would grow into the present-day city of St. Augustine, Florida. It was a Spanish city and fortress for more than 250 years until ceded to the United States in 1821. Today, two forts built and manned by those Spanish colonists stand as a testament to their bravery and persistence. They are Matanzas and the massive Castillo de San Marcos. The two forts were designated national monuments by President Calvin Coolidge in 1924. The smaller of the two is Fort Matanzas. The first look at the stone fortification is across the tall grasses of a salt marsh and gentle waters of the Matanzas River. Strategically placed on one of the river's islands, Matanzas guarded the south flank of St. Augustine from English attack. A boat ride from the monument's visitor center takes you to the fort. It was at this spot in 1565 that St. Augustine's founder, Spanish-born Don Pedro Menendez de Aviles, slaughtered the French colonists attempting to secure the region for France. The word Matanzas means slaughter in Spanish. 175 years later, construction began on the fort. Built over a 2-year span from 1740 to 1742, it is today much as it was over 250 years ago. The reason? The unique native building material.
Well, the beauty of the coquina, which is a unique rock here to the area of Florida, is its seashells. And when people come, they're a little amazed that it can actually be used as a fort and as a strong point, too. The coquina was found here right along the coast as early as the Spanish expeditions of De Soto and some of the early explorers. And it needs one other ingredient. It's got to have oyster shells to go ahead and bond it together. And it also has plaster on it, just like our ceiling over the room that we're in.
Surprisingly, coquina is highly resistant to the impact of cannonballs, hurricanes, and weathering. The fort itself is basically a 2-story building, 50 feet by 50 feet.
What we're in is known as a guard room or ganacion. It has a kitchen, including an English-style fireplace, a small dining table, and what I'm sitting on is the edge of a French-style bunk. It's a flat surface with a series of small mattresses. The other thing about it is it's also a gun front or a cannon deck, what we call a terraplane. So it has cannons on the front of the fort on an area that's perhaps 20 by 20, and upstairs is another room for the officer. And above that is a 30-foot watchtower that could see miles, up to 10 miles away. So it's quite small. It has 2 major rooms, a gun deck, and a small surface up on the top of the fort for an observation deck.
For the Spanish soldiers manning the fort, it would have been lonely duty. The contingent would have consisted of 8 soldiers, an officer, a gunner, and men with various maintenance skills. The small fort was well armed.
Historically, they had 5 guns on the fort for Spain, mostly what they call 6-pounders, which is fairly small, about the size of an American baseball, but they were devastatingly accurate at less than a mile. Larger gun, an 18-pounder, would fire a shot about 2+ miles.
After 2 centuries of raiding by the English, the purpose of Matanzas was to protect and warn the city of St. Augustine and its Castillo de San Marcos of invasion. One of the best times to experience Castillo de San Marcos is at night. In the eerie light, the fort seems to come alive with the spirits of long dead soldiers. In fact, all of St. Augustine is rampant with stories of ghosts. By day, the full majesty of the fort is revealed. A drawbridge spans the moat leading to the entrance. Here, the seal of Old Spain is clearly visible. Inside is a large parade ground. When after 9 wooden forts had failed, the Spanish king finally decided to build an impenetrable fort at St. Augustine. The engineers decided on using coquina from a nearby quarry. Construction began in 1679. The fort's design is a military marvel.
The whole point of your defensive fortification now is to absorb cannonball fire, to not break down under that kind of pressure. And so this design was actually designed over in Europe. The first kind of models that we see done like this were actually done by Leonardo da Vinci. We see some drawings made by him of this design. It's very short, kind of sturdy in a way, sloped walls to help absorb cannonball fire. And you have these things on the corners called bastions, which instead of your towers on a castle, now you can help with cross-firing tactics. And you can still see from all angles, which is what you would use those towers for. But that's why this design is going to be so key. Also, the base of these walls are 17 to 19 feet thick with this stone. So between the stone and the design itself, these are the reasons why this fort was so key and crucial in playing a part in the protection of this area.
7 years after its completion in 1695, Castillo de San Marcos was tested in Queen Anne's War when St. Augustine came under siege.
The weapons at the fort was a major part in what helped it, especially during those sieges, the siege of 1702, the siege of 1740. They tried to get as many weapons over here as possible. Cannons, since it is a fortification, is going to be the thing that helps them out the most. Obviously, they had muskets and things of that nature, but they had cannons ranging from little field cannons to massive cannons. And these cannons, these little cannons, would be able to project a cannonball from this fortification about 1.5 miles down the way. Your larger cannons would be able to project a cannonball about 3 to 3.5 miles down the way. And you have iron cannons here, bronze cannons here.
And of course, the fort had a full complement of musketeers. In the end, the fort survived the over 50-day siege in 1702 by the English colonists. However, most of the time, the Castillo was only lightly manned. Most of the time, the men lived and worked in St. Augustine.
The relationship between the fort and the townspeople was basically one that goes hand in hand with each other. The townspeople would go about their daily routines, and unless you were under attack or siege, you would only have about 12 to 24 soldiers here at one time, just looking out. All the soldiers would be in the town with their families. It's kind of like being a firefighter in today's standards. They would take turns coming here. They'd serve about 24 to 48-hour duties here, and then they'd rotate. Now, the thing is, if you're under attack or under siege, and all of the townspeople knew this, here's where you're going to come. This is their safe haven, the place they could go to during any siege, any attack, and they would feel safe here. Almost all of these rooms here at the fort would be full of barrels of food, supplies, storage. In fact, they had enough food and supplies in this fort at one time to last the entire town up to a year, which means it's going to be very difficult to try to starve the Spanish out of this fortification.
Today, the Castillo de San Marcos is the centerpiece of Old St. Augustine. a quaint European-style town. Both reminders of the days when the Spanish explored and ruled Florida. Spain has had a long history in Florida. Ponce de Leon, who sailed around the Florida Peninsula in 1512, attempted to establish a settlement 9 years later. The colony failed, but he is credited with giving Florida its name. Then in 1539, Conquistador Hernando de Soto launched his 4-year journey of exploration from present-day Tampa. While Spain dominated the early European history of Florida, it was an attempt by the French to establish a colony that forced Spain to solidify its presence in the southeastern United States. In 1564, Huguenots, Protestant Frenchmen, established Fort Caroline near modern-day Jacksonville. This act posed a grave danger and insult to the Catholic Spanish crown. The governor of Cuba immediately dispatched Admiral Pedro Menendez to establish a permanent base in Florida and remove the French threat. In 1565, he established the colony of St. Augustine. In the same year, he routed the French from the fort and massacred over 200 of them near the future site of Fort Matanzas. Pedro Menendez is considered to be the father of Spanish Florida.
The Spanish is setting this area as a priority now. They're going to do what they have to keep control of this area. Pedro Menendez takes on that leader role, and he's not going to make the mistakes that some of the other former Spanish soldiers have made while exploring the Florida areas. He's going to build up better relations with the natives. He's also going to work that leadership role, make sure there's enough food source for his men, and make sure that the other Spanish strongholds are going to bring him supplies and necessities so that starvation is not an option.
In 1570, the Florida garrison was promised subsidies from the crown. Securing the coast had become highly important to the wealth of Spain.
I think one of the things that's hard to understand is why would Spain spend so much money on Florida? There's no gold, there's no silver, the Indian cultures are not like those found in the Aztec world or down in the Mayan world, but Florida controls the coast. And because of the coast and the Gulf Stream, ships leaving Havana, Cuba, taking gold, silver, Indian artifacts, jewelry, all back home to Spain have to come right by St. Augustine. So although the garrison never flourished and was never profitable, it was always a money pit for the Spanish. It helps guard those ships going home from Havana straight home to Spain. And that's a long, unexposed voyage for them. Everything north of us is British, everything to the west was French. And at that time, the Gulf Stream usually is within 30 to 40 miles of where St. Augustine is located. So the peninsula and this magical highway heading home to Spain was the critical function why we're here.
Besides colonizing Florida, Pedro Menendez had another goal: convert the Native Americans to Catholicism. Starting first with St. Augustine and expanding all the way into the Florida Panhandle, the Spanish established over 40 missions. Often situated near or within an Indian village, the missions formed a trade network for food and goods. Nevertheless, throughout the 1600s, St. Augustine never flourished. Spain was always behind on its financial and material support, and the inhabitants were always on the verge of starvation. Oddly, the Spanish never took advantage of its early presence on the East Coast in the battle for control of North America between France, Spain, and England, and later the United States. However, when an American colony was established in 1670 at present-day Charleston, South Carolina, Spain finally acted. Now the American colonists were only 2 sailing days away. The result was the construction of the massive permanent fort of Castillo de San Marcos. After its completion in 1695, a series of attacks and counterattacks began between the American colonists to the north and the Spanish at St. Augustine. None were decisive. Finally, after the French and Indian War, St. Augustine became a British colony. It was ceded back to Spain after the American Revolution, only to become part of the United States in 1821. No place has had a more pivotal role in the colonial South than St. Augustine. A rich history that can still be experienced today. Today, playful bottlenose dolphins from St. Augustine's Inlet are visible to the visitors at the Castillo de San Marcos. When the Spanish arrived here, they found the most biodiverse area in the continental United States. Florida, with its tropical climate, is best known for its grass-dominated freshwater marshes, particularly the Everglades. This is prime habitat for the American alligator, one of only 2 species of alligator in the world. Adult male alligators can grow up to 18 feet in length and weigh over 1,000 pounds. Anything, including humans, that enters the domain of an alligator is potential prey. Alligators are most commonly seen resting along the banks of rivers or islands, or floating with just their eyes above water. The most spectacular ecosystems around St. Augustine are the hardwood or coastal hammocks. These ecosystems would have been familiar to the early Spanish conquistadors from their explorations of the Caribbean islands and the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. It is the jungle. A boardwalk in Fort Matanzas National Monument takes visitors along the edge of one of these hardwood wonders. These localized stands of trees near St. Augustine are dominated by the live oak. This spectacular tree is often draped in Spanish moss. Other epiphytes, plants that grow on other plants, and ferns. Other species of trees in the hammocks are the mahoganies, red bays, cedars, hollies, and an assortment of native and non-native palms. Being in one of these forests is an amazing experience of rich sounds and visual textures. The hammocks are also prime breeding habitat for an assortment of colorful birds. Wood storks, herons, and egrets. Here they are feeding their young. In areas dominated by grasses, these islands of trees are also prime roosting places for many other birds. The primary bird of prey here is the osprey. A year-round resident, it nests here. In all, there are over 250 species of birds in the 2 monuments. The waters around the monuments are also home to Florida's most unusual animal.
Manatee do come into the area here in the summertime. We do see them fairly frequently in the summer when they're moving through the area and expanding from the springs, which are located inland of the fort here, the central part of Florida. So the manatees pass through the area. They use it for calving and so forth as well.
Manatees are large, fully aquatic marine mammals, sometimes called sea cows. They are herbivores, spending most of their time grazing in shallow waters. Adults can weigh up to 1,200 pounds and reach lengths up to 10 feet. No two national monuments offer more history and spectacular wildlife in one place than Fort Matanzas and Fort Castilla de San Marcos National Monuments.
In the National Monument System, Fort Frederica National Monument on one of Georgia's barrier islands is the only one that preserves what is essentially a ghost town. A town and fort that once secured the South for the British from Spanish domination.
Frederica, Georgia was once one of the most beautiful cities in America's colonial South. Established in 1736, troops from the fort led the defense against the Spanish invasion, thereby securing the Georgia colony for America. Frederica was once the primary residence of Georgia's founder, James Oglethorpe. But now, it is a ghost town. All that remains are ruins. Old foundations in a small part of the fort. Fort Frederica National Monument is situated on one of Georgia's barrier islands, St. Simons. It was designated a monument in 1936 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The once broad Main Street is clearly visible as a ghostly lone British soldier walks along what was once a bustling thoroughfare. His destination? What remains of the old fort? Its powder magazine and cannon fortification. He fires his musket in salute to the troops that once served in battle near this former glorious southern city. Interpretive Park Ranger Denise Spear now leads tours through the city ruins.
We're standing at the entrance to Fort Frederica, the town of Frederica, and if you look on either side of this bridge, you see a hump of earth which goes down into a ditch. The ditch is the remnants of the moat that used to be 6 feet deep, 10 feet wide. And this hump of earth on either side used to be the wall that went around the whole town. It was 6 feet wide and 10 feet high. It had a wooden palisade on top with sharpened sticks, basically, big spikes going all the way down the top of the wall. And it was 1 mile in circumference to protect the entire town. And if you look behind me on either side, you see these wooden pieces sticking out of the ground. And these represent the four corners of the 2 guardhouses that were on either side of the entranceway to the town of Frederica. And these would be manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by soldiers to make sure that you had legitimate business in the town of Frederica, because it was a military outpost. It was a military town. Once you pass Frederica's gates, you come into this wide open road called Broad Street. From this tree line to this tree line is how wide the street was, hence the name, Broad Street. The houses be lined on either side with the trees. We know the British planted orange trees along the street for shade and for the fragrance of the orange blossoms. One of the reasons why this street was so broad or wide is to make it as a fire break. If fire broke out on this side of the town, hopefully this street was so wide that the flames would not be able to leap over the street and catch the houses on this side on fire. Another possible reason for having it so wide is because, once again, this is a military town. We have troops that have to get to the town gate to the fort behind me, you need a nice wide road from them to march back and forth. We're at the ruins of the Hawkins and Davison's house. This is probably the most important house that the archaeologists found out here in the 1940s. It's an 18th century duplex. We had the Davison family living on this side, and on this other side we had Dr. Hawkins and his wife. This wall down the middle was their common wall, and this was very important for the archaeologists to find because it helped them determine the first lot line of Frederica. Everybody in town had the same size lot, 60 by 90, and by finding this first lot line, we were able to pace off and figure out where everybody lived in the town of Frederica. Right now I'm standing within Fort Frederica. Fort Frederica had an earth wall around it similar to the town wall. It had several buildings within, storehouses, as well as the building behind me. This building was the powder magazine for the fort. Inside the two rooms were kept all the ammunition for the cannon. We're talking black powder as well as the cannonballs themselves. Because the most important part of this fort, of course, are the guns, the big cannon that would be here. About 15 cannon in all. And as you see over here, most of them would have been trained down the Frederica River, because this is the most likely spot that the Spanish would come to try to attack the fort. So you want as many guns pointed downriver as possible so you could shoot at those ships before they can shoot at you.
And come the Spanish did in 1742. A few miles from Frederica, a second unit of the monument commemorates the battle between the British and Spanish troops. It's called the Battle of the Bloody Marsh. Here in this salt marsh, the British, led by Oglethorpe, defeated Spanish invaders from St. Augustine. It supposedly ran red with blood. Beside the marsh, there is a wonderful coastal hardwood hammock preserved in this unit of Fort Frederica National Monument. As the 18th century dawned on the North American continent, the British controlled the Atlantic seacoast from Maine to Charleston in the Carolina colony. The Spanish controlled the seacoast from St. Augustine to the tip of Florida. In between was a gap of disputed land. Right in the middle of that land was St. Simon's Island.
The main folks who are looking for this land to see who would own it are the Spanish and the British. On St. Simon's Island, the Spanish had a long record of living here. They had missions on the island, driven back both by kind of economic setbacks as well as English raiders. And ultimately, Frederica is the result of the English attempting to find their own little place in this debatable land.
The way the British did that was to turn the area into a new colony, Georgia Colony, a sort of utopian colony. In 1733, over 100 immigrants, led by James Edward Oglethorpe, landed near what would become present-day Savannah, Georgia. The new colony's founding principles were somewhat unusual.
Georgia, somewhat of an idealistic place in the sense that originally the idea was it was to be for the worthy poor of London, people getting a new chance here in the new world. Some of the rules are rather unique. For a southern colony, one of them is no slavery. Slavery is outlawed from the beginning. Of course, that doesn't last very long. But the other one is no hard alcohol, which was actually a real gripe for the people. And the one that probably makes most people in the modern sense laugh is the idea of no lawyers in the Georgia land. The idea being lawyers were the ones who were drove the people into debtor's prison back in England in the first place.
In 1734, Oglethorpe, now the de facto governor of the new colony, concluded that St. Simon's Island was a place to build Georgia's military outpost. 2 years later, construction began. Under Oglethorpe's personal supervision, the fort's settlement developed rapidly.
These buildings made of tabby and brick really represent the settlers' dreams. They wanted to stay here forever. They could have built, dirty, ugly houses, but instead what they build are buildings that were meant to last forever. Very little may be still there, but what you see really represent the dreams of those settlers to be here.
With Frederica well established, Oglethorpe led a failed raid on St. Augustine and the Castilla de San Marcos in 1741. Then, the Spanish counterattacked.
1742, you really see the culmination of Spanish attempts to reclaim what they considered their own soil. When the Spanish landed on the island, there were two battles, July 7, 1742, between the British and the Spanish. The first battle was only a half mile from the town walls. The British defeated them fairly handily. Its name was Gully Hole Creek. The more famous, probably because of its name, is the Battle of Bloody Marsh, in which several hundred Spaniards were faced down by a much smaller number of British, English, and Scottish troops. That battle has been blown up in history to mean that several hundreds of Spaniards were killed. In reality, the numbers of killed were much smaller, but in a sense, it was the high water mark. It was the last time Spain tried to reclaim this chunk of soil. Ultimately, for Frederica, it meant that the Spanish have been defeated, everyone's happy. Only problem is there's no longer any need for the military here. The day the soldiers saved Frederica, they also doomed it.
Although Frederica was abandoned 16 years later, Georgia was ready to take its place as one of America's original 13 colonies. The climate of St. Simon's Island is subtropical. The reason Oglethorpe chose it for his military outpost is that the Native Americans had already cleared away a piece of the jungle. The ecosystem here was one of those coastal hammocks made up of hardwood trees. Ecosystems dominated by live oaks and palms that once thrived on many of the barrier islands in the region. Barrier Islands are long, narrow offshore deposits of sand or sediments that parallel the coastline. Some barrier islands can extend for hundreds of miles or more and are often found in chains along the coastline. The islands are separated from the mainland by a shallow bay or a salt marsh. The formation of barrier islands is complex. As the glaciers melted and receded 12,000 years ago, sea levels began to rise. The rising waters carried sediments from the eroding beach ridges and deposited them along shallow areas just off the new coastline. Today, the barrier islands are popular tourist destinations and serve two main functions. First, they protect the coastlines from severe storm damage. Second, they harbor habitats, such as St. Simon's coastal hammock, that are refuges for wildlife. In the 21st century, these sanctuaries are threatened by the impacts of climate change. As rising seawaters and more intense storm surges could wash them away completely.
I hope you enjoyed our trip through the Spanish South. I'm Jordan Murphy.